So I'm sure the colleague is watching this on the live stream, and he'll have a tweet here soon. We're tweeting back and forth with people with questions, if there are any. Thanks very much. Our first panel of 4 will be chaired by our chair of the department, Candace Nelson, and it'll be on parties, the campaigns, and the electorate. But we have 3 other panels, including, I should have said, a keynote speech by Tom Mann at lunch, a working lunch, and we'll end with a lively roundtable with 3 top scholars, which we'll introduce later. But Candy will introduce each of these, and we're going to try to keep the panelists to 12 to 15 minutes each. Most of them have 50 PowerPoint slides, so that's going to be very interesting. Candy? Right.
Thank you, Jim. Just for the record, I was not the senior colleague that... let's get going, because we've got, as Jim said, a full day. To my immediate left is Alan Abramowitz. Alan is the Albert W. Barkley Professor of Political Science at Emory University. He has authored or co-authored 6 books, dozens of contributions to edited volumes, and more than 50 articles in political science journals dealing with political parties, elections, and voting behavior in the United States. He is also one of the nation's leading elections forecasters. His Time for Change model has correctly predicted the popular vote winner in every presidential election since 1988. His most recent book is The Polarized Public: Why American Government is So Dysfunctional. To Alan's left is Mark Hetherington. Mark is a professor of political science at Vanderbilt. He is the author of Why Trust Matters: Declining Political Trust and the Demise of American Liberalism, and the co-author of Authoritarianism and Polarization in American Politics. He's also published numerous journal articles in the top journals in political science and is the winner of several teaching awards. And at the far end of the table is Michael McDonald. Michael is an associate professor of government and politics at George Mason University and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. His research interests include voting behavior, redistricting, Congress, American political development, and political methodology. He's the co-author of Numerical Issues in Statistical Computing for the Social Scientist and co-author of The Marketplace of Democracy, Electoral Competition, and American Politics. His research appears in top scholarly journals and in several edited volumes. He's also a co-principal investigator on the Public Mapping Project, a project to encourage public participation in redistricting. And we're going to start with Alan.
Okay.
And the panelists are going to sort of have to move a little bit so everyone can see.
Now I have to figure out how to get to the... I have no idea how to get to this. I think we definitely challenged on these things. I will correct one statement that was made earlier while we're waiting to get the PowerPoint slides up. The statement that if anyone has a magic bullet, we won't let you shoot it. If you come to Georgia, we'll let you shoot it. Anywhere. A church, a bar, a school.
Not state capitol, though.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about polarization in the American electorate, and as the title slide indicates, my thesis is that the new American electorate today is partisan, sorted, and polarized. So if we look at the results of recent... Okay, I'm going to have to stand here talking to the microphone, which I hate doing, but I want to start off by talking a little bit about the results of recent elections in the United States, which I think tell us that we are in a new era of electoral competition. And the key characteristics of this new era are, 1, intense 2-party competition at the national level, 2, increasing one-party domination of many states and congressional districts at the same time, and finally, a high degree of consistency in the results of elections at different levels of government and over time. So if we look at the results of recent presidential elections in the United States, actually if we look at the results going all the way back to the 50s, we can see that, and kind of grouping them into groups of 4, that the recent elections have been by far the most competitive on average and the most consistent in their results, the least variance over time. In fact, to find a group of elections that have been this close and with so little variation from election to election, you have to go back to the late 19th century. That's the last time that we had elections that kind of looked like that. Yet, While the nation is very competitive, we know that when we look below the national level that the country is very divided. And we have these, the red areas and the blue areas, as very well depicted, I think, by this map, which also points out the extreme importance of Ohio in the last election, if you remember the media coverage there. So looking at the results of the presidential election at the state level in 2012, of course, what we saw was that there were almost no competitive states. Only 4 states were decided by a margin of less than 5 points, whereas 19 states were decided by a margin of 20 points or more, including many big states. So competitive national election, very few competitive state elections. This is a big change from what we saw back in the 60s and 70s. When we had nationally competitive elections, we had many more states that were highly competitive. So 76 was a very similar election in terms of the national outcome, but very different when we look at the state level. And that difference is even more striking if you look at the distribution of electoral votes. So in 1976, 299 electoral votes came from states where the margin was under 5 points. In 2012, that was 75. And on the other end, we went from 66 electoral votes in states that were landslides, 15 points or more, to 289 electoral votes in those states in 2012. A very dramatic change, and it's happened. We've been seeing this happening over time. 2012 was the most extreme case in that regard. Same thing's true with congressional districts. Of course, there are far fewer marginal districts, far more that are very one-sided, and it's not because of redistricting. Redistricting may contribute to it, but it's certainly happening regardless of that. The other thing we see is tremendous consistency in the results of these elections over time. So the Obama 2008 margin predicts the Obama 2012 margin at the state level almost perfectly. That's also true at the county level. It's true at the congressional district level. It's true at just about any level you want. Even 2008 by 2004, we see an extremely high correlation, not quite as high as this, of course, with completely different pairs of candidates. So we're seeing this tremendous consistency. We're seeing, as Gary Jacobson has pointed out, this, strengthening relationship between the presidential results and the congressional results. The correlation in 2012 was, I think, the strongest it's been, since ever? Okay. It's really quite remarkable when you look at something like that. So why is this happening? This is actually one of our students at Emory who, was asking me this question. And so I think the explanation for all of these results, patterns that we're seeing, is that we have today a strongly partisan electorate. And we certainly see that, and when we look at the individual level, the highest party loyalty in the history of the American National Election Studies, 93% of partisans, including independent leaners, voting for their own party. The lowest rates of ticket splitting in many, many years, if ever. So it's quite remarkable that we're seeing this. So this, of course, raises a question for a lot of people, which is, what about all those voters who call themselves independents or register as independents? And we've seen a lot of talk about the fact that actually the percentage of registered independents has been increasing in states that have party registration. What does that mean? How does that fit in with this? Well, first of all, we know that the overwhelming majority of independent identifiers are leaners. In 2012, it was 72% of identifiers of independents lean toward a party. And we know that those leaners vote overwhelmingly for the party they lean toward. Not just for president, but for House, for Senate, for everything. We also know that their opinions on issues such as their ideological identification match up very well with other partisans. Independent Democrats are actually a bit more liberal than weak Democrats. Independent Republicans are actually more conservative than weak Republicans, and that's true across a range of issues, not just ideological identification. As far as party registration is concerned, what we find is that once you control for party identification, which party people are registered with makes absolutely no difference in how they vote. So if you're a Democrat, in terms of identification, including leaners, if you happen to be registered as an independent or even as a Republican, and there are a few who are for some weird reason, it has no effect on how you vote. That what matters is your party identification. Party registration tells us nothing about how people are going to vote once we control for party identification. Okay, why do we have this big party divide? Why do we see the strong partisanship? My argument is that it reflects deeper divides in American society. And I'm going to briefly touch on 3: the racial divide, the cultural divide, and the ideological divide. The racial divide, I believe, is the single most important factor in the growing polarization of the American electorate. We see a growing racial divide between the political parties in the United States. If I show you a picture of a political rally in the United States, and I ask you to guess, if there were no signs, buttons, or anything like that, is this a Republican rally or a Democratic rally? I don't think anyone would have any difficulty, figuring that out. Likewise, if I showed you this picture, okay, there is a problem here. There is a bit of a clue. It's not just the American flags. So let's modify the picture slightly. Almost everyone would be able to figure out that that's probably a Republican rally. Democrats and Republicans look different. And when the supporters of each party look at the other party, they see that. And they see that, those people aren't like us. And one of the main reasons why they think that is because of race. And this reflects the reality that the racial makeup of the party coalitions has been diverging over a long time, and especially recently. So the Democratic Party is increasingly dependent on votes from non-whites. The Republican Party, not so much. In 2012, there was a huge racial divide. Non-whites made up a record 28% of the electorate. That's more than doubled just since 1992, and we know it's going to continue increasing. Message to Dick Morris, it's going to continue increasing. Okay. Romney won the white vote by a landslide, 20 percentage points according to the National Exit Poll. Obama more than offset that by winning an overwhelming majority of non-white voters. Non-whites made up 45% of Obama voters versus 11% of Romney voters. Now, this is from the National Election Study, so the composition is slightly different, but it's about the same. So here's the Obama coalition in 2012, according to the ANES, and just 23% of Obama's voters were African Americans across the whole country. Of course, in the South, it was much higher than that. Here are Romney's voters. 1% were African Americans. And that guy probably just answered the question incorrectly. Okay. So the growing racial divide is contributing to a growing ideological divide between the parties. We see this again in the exit poll data. Obama voters overwhelmingly come down on the side of larger government and support for the health care law. Romney voters oppose a larger role for government, oppose the health care law. It's very consistent across a range of questions. So the role of government is a big divide between the parties. We also see a big cultural divide in 2012 as well. Okay. So white evangelical or born-again Christians vote overwhelmingly for Romney, even though they don't like Romney. Okay. They supported other candidates in the primaries, just as they did in 2008. They didn't like McCain. They still vote overwhelmingly Republican in the general election. Those something else or none voters vote overwhelmingly for Obama. Gay, lesbian, and bisexual voters overwhelmingly vote for Obama, of course. We also see it on these cultural issues. On the issue of abortion, there's a big split between Obama and Romney voters. On the issue of same-sex marriage, there's a big divide between Obama and Romney voters. So religious observance has become a bigger divide in American politics today than social class. In the 2012 ANES, if you control for religious observance and you compare white voters who are highly observant, who attend religious services every week or more, versus those who rarely or never attend religious services, and those two groups together make up over 80% of the electorate, by the way, leaving out a much smaller group in the middle. What you find is that highly observant whites vote overwhelmingly for Romney regardless of income. Highly observant whites who have family incomes of under $15,000, I don't even have that group in here, it's a fairly small percentage of voters, voted over 80% for Mitt Romney. So religion trumps class among white voters. That is overwhelmingly the case. So what we're seeing here is diverging party coalitions. If we compare 72 with 12, we see there's been big changes in the makeup of the two-party coalitions. The Democratic coalition is much more non-white and more liberal. The Republican coalition is much more conservative than it was. Okay. So are we just better sorted? So I know this is one of the big debates, of course, about these changes in American public opinion. Is the electorate just better sorted? And by the way, there's no important question in political science that can't be addressed by using Lego blocks. It's always been my view. So the answer is, in my opinion, no. Or rather, no! So let's look at a case of asymmetric polarization in the American electorate. Here's the distribution of Democratic and Republican voters in 1972 on the ideology scale. The only change I've made here is I've combined 1 with 2 and 6 with 7. So it's now a 5-point scale. All right? So here's what it looked like in 1972. There's a lot of overlap between the two parties. Relatively few voters in either party are out at the ends of the scale. Here's what it looks like in 2012. Notice particularly that, now that's a big change, particularly among Republicans. So what we're seeing here is that Republicans are moving away from the center. Democrats are moving a bit away from the center, but not nearly as much. There's still a lot of moderate Democrats. There are far fewer moderate Republicans. There are a lot more conservative Republicans. So we're seeing the same kind of shift that we've seen in Congress within the electorate. Asymmetric polarization with Republicans moving sharply to the right. This underestimates polarization, by the way, because moderate Democrats are much more liberal than moderate Republicans if you look at their views on specific issues. So here's their views on the role of government scale. In 2012, there were 3 questions that asked, sort of general questions about should the government be doing more or less to solve problems. There's a big party divide on that, relatively few in the middle. Here are opinions on the Affordable Care Act in 2012. Okay. Again, what we're seeing is Democrats overwhelmingly coming down on the 7-point scale at 1 and 2, Republicans overwhelmingly at 6 and 7. Very few people in the middle. This isn't unique to 2012 or to opinions on the Affordable Care Act. This was true on a question in the 2008 ANES on creating a single-payer healthcare system in the United States. What we saw on that scale is, again, tremendous polarization between the two parties before the debate over the ACA even began. So that polarization in Congress was reflecting a deep divide within the American electorate over what the role of government in providing health care should be. Here's the results on the key question on abortion in the 2012 ANES, which is the woman's choice question. This is the question. It's a 9-point scale. I don't know why they decided on a 9-point scale. Why do we have to get away from the 7-point scales? Anyway, it's a 9-point scale, but I've combined 1 and 2 and 6 and 7. Or rather, I've combined 8 and 9 and 1 and 2. Anyway, so I've turned it into a 7-point scale because I just like 7-point scales. But you can see, again, that there's quite a bit of polarization. There are a larger percentage of Republicans and Democrats on the wrong side of this issue. But regardless of that, there are very few people in the middle on this. And this is the question that predicts most highly party ID and vote compared with any of the other abortion questions. So this is politically the question about abortion that matters. The other thing we're seeing over time is growing consistency of opinions, or what converts call constraint. Constraint has increased dramatically. We have a series of questions on social welfare issues that began in 1984, runs to 2012. The average correlation in 1984 was 0.29 across those issues, and correlation with the ideology question was 0.25. In 2012, the average correlation is 0.5, and the correlation with ideology is 0.47. In terms of shared variance, that's an increase in strength of about 3 times. 3 times stronger relationship. Here's asymmetric polarization again. Here's the distribution on that scale in 1984. Here it is in 2012. Democrats have barely moved. They're still mostly in the middle on these social welfare issues. Republicans are much more conservative on those social welfare issue questions than they were in 1984. So again, we're seeing asymmetric polarization there. There's also growing consistency between social welfare and cultural issues. So here's the relationship between the social welfare issue scale and support for the pro-choice position on the traditional ANES 4-point abortion question. In 1984, there's no relationship at all. Social welfare liberalism is uncorrelated with liberalism on abortion. Here it is in 2012. There's a fairly strong relationship. It's a correlation of 0.28, I believe. So that correlation has been steadily increasing over time. So we're seeing these issues reinforcing each other to a much greater extent. We're also seeing growing affective polarization over time. Feelings toward the other party and its candidates are becoming much more polarized. Here's the feeling thermometer ratings of Gerald Ford in 1976, okay? This is just a distribution among all voters. You can see that, and Ford lost the election, but he, was still pretty much liked by almost everyone. Here's Ronald Reagan in 1984. Now, Ronald Reagan was a pretty polarizing guy, and yet we see it's certainly a more polarized distribution. The standard deviation is increasing, but they're still clustered. The opinions are still clustered on the positive end of the scale. Here's George W. Bush in 2004. Here's Barack Obama in 2012. The standard deviation of the feeling thermometer scale has increased dramatically over time, and the divide between Democrats and Republicans has increased dramatically over time. I've got a lot more evidence about that in my paper. We're also seeing increasing correlations of the feeling thermometer scales with party ID and ideology. Especially ideology has increased quite a bit over time. So this affective polarization is closely connected with ideological polarization. In conclusion, I hope I've stayed within my 15 minutes. I believe the U.S. has entered a new era of electoral competition, as I've said, talked about the major characteristics of it. The reason this has happened is because of the changes in the American electorate. The American electorate today, compared with 20, 30, 40 years ago, is more partisan, better sorted, and more polarized. Sorting and polarization go together. They are almost inseparable, in fact. That's true among elites, and it's true among the public as well. And that ultimately the deep partisan divide that we're seeing in Washington today reflects a deep partisan divide in the American electorate. When Democrats and Republicans in Congress go back to their districts, the voters that they hear from, the people they represent, the people who vote for them, not just in primaries, but even in general elections, are very, very different from each other. They're different in terms of race, they're different in terms of ideology, and they're different in terms of their values and cultural orientations. And the divide that we see in Washington is very much a reflection of that deep divide within the American electorate. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you, Alan.